Vi börjar. Hello there and welcome to Norrsken House and day number 9 of the Nordic Climate Action Weeks. We are here in Stockholm and we have people with us also in Madrid at COP25. And I'm really pleased to say that we have lots and lots of young people, both here and in Madrid at the moment. And that is good because that is what we have been aiming for. Today's theme has been the link between climate and biodiversity. And that is a very, very important question that should have been highlighted much more at COP25 than it actually has. Today we have actually heard that it hasn't been highlighted at all so far, so it's good that we are discussing it. Because in May this year, the UN Scientific Expert Panel for Biodiversity presented the first global report on the status of Earth's animal, planets, and ecosystems, and that was a very alarming report. It actually showed that 1 million species, both animals and plants, are under threat of extinction. The fact is that not all politicians have yet understood how serious this threat is. And for this reason, we need to discuss this and we need for our politicians to hear what we are saying. And I'd like to present to you now 2 of the guests that I have with me here in Stockholm, Tine Svendsen and Gustaf Zachrisson. You will get to speak later on, but not yet, because now I will give the word to Madrid, where we have 4 guests. And our moderator and guest number 1 in Madrid is Rasmus Nordqvist, who is a Danish member of parliament. And Rasmus, you will continue presenting the rest of the guests.
Yes, thank you, and hello, Stockholm. It almost sounds like the Eurovision, and I love it. I'm standing here today with Stina Bagge and Monika Skadborg. We just finished a meeting, very interesting meeting, with some really hardcore experts, I would say. It's one of these meetings where you really learn something every minute that goes by. You get more clever on biodiversity. And we were Nordic politicians, youth delegates as well. And now we also have Per Holmgren from the European Parliament with us on stage. But I'm going to begin by asking a question here on this stage. And Stina, you are representing Arctic youth.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit about why it's important to come here to Madrid to the climate negotiations and talking about biodiversity?
Yeah. Well, we live in a planetary crisis, right? We all know that. We've known the science for 40 years, and now it's more clear than ever with the IPCC reports on 1.5, and especially with this IPCC report on special report on oceans and the cryosphere. And the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, they're interlinked, so they need to be discussed together. That's why it's so important, and currently they aren't. We aren't discussing climate change at the biodiversity negotiations, and we aren't discussing biodiversity loss at COP. And that needs to be done in order to get this integrated, holistic solution.
And you, Monika, you are a youth delegate from Denmark. And it's been important for the Nordic countries to not only invite youth to come to the meeting, but also to invite them to be part of the processes here. And you've been here in Madrid for some days now. And could you tell us a bit about how it is to be a UN youth delegate and how much you can get your words through to politicians like me, and not least the world leaders sitting a few meters away from us negotiating at this moment?
So I've been a youth delegate for nearly 2 years now. And part of it, of course, is to come to the negotiations and try to group together with some other youth representatives to try to lobby some of our points into the negotiation papers, such as, for example, why is there no mention of the ecosystem crisis that we are facing? Another part of it is also to trying to communicate home what is happening or maybe what isn't happening at the COP, and trying to get more momentum on our national policymakers so we're able to go home and shout at them until they do better national implementation of the things we are agreeing here.
And the two of you, are you positive after what you've seen for the last few days here? I mean, I know you've been involved for quite some time now, Monika, but how is it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been at COPs for 4 years, so I'm not surprised that we're moving slowly, because we are. Last week was disastrous. There were basically nothing happening in any question. But I mean, I need to stay positive, especially when we have this amazing youth movement that's being created and that Greta has kind of formed for us. So I'm hopeful that if we don't get the decision that we need, there will be an uproar. Young people won't accept that.
And what is your opinion after 2 years as a youth delegate?
Yeah, I think I have the same opinion. It's stressful being here at the negotiations because you sit there in the rooms, sometimes literally on the floor, watching the civil servants do their best to protect their national interests and putting brackets around all the text to avoid things moving forward. Super depressing. But on the other hand, when they do agree on something, such as the rule book that was agreed in Katowice, it's really a great tool that we can go home to our national governments and take that paper and whack them on the head until they do something. It doesn't move as fast as it should, but at least it moves, so we have to stay positive.
And what do you say, Per, after a few days here?
Very mixed feelings. I've met a lot of people from civil society, a lot of companies as well that really wants to see this transition. But then every now and then when you see the leaked paper from the negotiations, you understand that a lot of the negotiations is basically about creating loopholes for certain countries that don't want to take the responsibility needed for all countries.
And you were part before, Monika, as well of the discussion on the biodiversity and climate crisis. Could you say something more about this conversation? I mean, what do you think when you heard the experts we had sitting just across us a few meters away who were quite clear in their message?
Yeah, they were super clear in their message that biodiversity and climate change are interlinked crises and we have to deal with them together. And currently, politically, that is not really what we are seeing. So we have a huge task ahead of us to try to convince our policymakers to mainstream both of these crises into policymaking.
Are you succeeding in that?
Yes and no. Again, I think we're succeeding in a way that civil society has started to realize it, that like you say, it's interlinked. And I think that's the first step.
Yeah. But you were also mentioning that before, that you thought that, Monika, that we just finished a climate law in Denmark and it's not mentioning the biodiversity crisis. Do you think also it's a task before we had this toolkit going around from biodiversity activists to climate activists? Is part of that question also to bring the agendas more together?
I mean, I know sometimes biodiversity activists are talking about the climate change movement as though, oh no, we are talking so much about climate change that we might forget about biodiversity. I think we should see it the other way around. Actually, that the more we talk about climate change, the people talking about that are also the ones who are aware that we have a biodiversity crisis. So giving more space to the climate agenda and listening more to those people in the street also helps saving the bees and the trees and our ecosystem.
And how is it in European Parliament? You just declared climate emergency.
Yeah.
What about the biodiversity? Is that agenda alive?
Well, in certain areas it is. I mean, I'm part of the Green Group and we are 75 parliamentarians. And of course, we are very aware of this. And of course, it is two issues that are very, very interlinked and we should discuss them together all the time. We've had 5 previous mass extinctions on this planet, and 4 of them were caused by climate change. On a scale that was probably 10 or 100 times slower than the climate change we are expecting during this century. So one thing that we can be very sure of is that if we don't manage to keep the global warming below 2 degrees, that will cause even more loss of biodiversity. And at the same time, biodiversity is what I usually talk about as an insurance company of the nature. And the more biodiversity we have, the better the situation is if we are approaching 2 or 2.1 or 2.2 degrees. So we really have to focus on both of these issues and everything that is unsustainable or sustainable.
And could any of you, because I always know that at this time of the day, I mean 6 o'clock, we want to just have a smile on our face for a few minutes, because it has been a bit depressing day today down here in Madrid. It has not been a hurrah all day long. So could you give us just a sparkle of optimism on if you see these two agendas actually also moving together to actually come up with some of the solutions? Or am I pushing it too hard?
No, but I'm gonna repeat myself and say again that I think there is more. There's knowledge now going around that okay, these two areas aren't actually two. They're part of the planet, and they together form the planetary crisis. So the fact that has kind of been realized again is. It shouldn't be ignored in final composition. I really, really hope that there's some mentioning of that in the final outcome.
I mean, something that gives me hope is that we have been forgetting about nature-based solutions until now, and they have such a huge potential. So if we start harvesting that, then we can really go a long way. 2 months ago, I was in Copenhagen listening to this Norwegian researcher explaining their new estimates of how much carbon storage potential there is in nature-based solutions in the Nordic Ocean. And we haven't been talking about that at all when we try to solve the climate crisis. So the fact that we just noticed that is something that gives hope.
And I mean, one very positive thing is the fact that the awareness all around the world is rising so fast. Maybe often focused on climate, but I really think that once you get aware of the climate issues, you also start to think about biodiversity and a lot of other questions. So in that way, they are interlinked in a positive way.
Yeah. The Nordic cooperation has really decided to put youth in center also of the negotiations, the global negotiations on biodiversity. And we've seen how much youth have pushed the global climate agenda. So there's big hope. There's a lot on the way already. There has to be done this new global deal on nature and people, really addressing how to act on this. And I know you've been working in Stockholm on that as well. So I'm a bit curious if you could tell us, I mean, what you have been doing today. I know this is a question for you, Tine Svendsen. If you could share with us your day here in Madrid.
Yes, definitely. We have been a big group of youth from different Nordic countries that have been discussing the connectivity of climate change and biodiversity crisis. And we've done it on the base of this toolkit made by the Nordic corporations, divided into 5 sessions. So we've been different groups discussing both what kind of targets should this new deal possess, evaluating what did the last IT targets miss or lack. Then we've been discussing how can we bind, or should we bind parties and countries to these coming targets? How can you make biodiversity laws, for example, and how should the responsible be divided on different countries? Should it be targets occurring to regions or countries, and should they be legal binding? And how is it responsible in the global perspective also, concerning that we have some biodiversity hotspots in countries that have lower incomes and so on. So we've been discussing for 40 minutes, and then also including parliamentarians, two parliamentarians that have been listening to our discussions, and then having in the end a briefing on the suggestions from the youth, And definitely it's been underpinning what you're saying, Monika, that it's a very engaged youth in the climate crisis, but then also in the biodiversity crisis. So a very engaged youth that maybe did not necessarily know the connectivity of or the severity of the biodiversity crisis, but it's not that they don't care. So I think people that are climate conscious are definitely also conscious about the biodiversity and just the situation of the earth. So that's definitely been underpinned today and been given some good suggestions and a discussion around tables and also with parliamentarians, I would say.
And Rasmus was just saying there that this was not a very happy day, that many things were not so positive. Was this not a happy day for you either?
I think it was a quite happy day, actually. I really felt, of course, I felt just energized by meeting so many young people sharing the same concerns as me and coming with so many good solutions and perspectives on this crisis, and noting the complexity of it and how many different perspectives that we have to take in case. But so just we have a very also informed and well-educated youth that are willing to sacrifice and really willing to engage and willing to make action. So I think it's been very, empowering and energizing and uplifting here in Stockholm.
That's very good. And you had some parliamentarians with you there listening to the messages that came from your workshop. And actually now, Gustaf, this is your opportunity, because we have a member of parliament and a member of the European Parliament with us now. And we should very much like to hear what kind of messages came out of your workshop today, and direct them now when you can, straight to the parliamentarians.
Yeah, okay. So I think two conclusions that we can make from here is, as you said, young people are realizing how all the environmental issues are connected. Like, while there are still some, probably older people, still questioning climate change, we have from the start been connected, and we have seen examples of plastic pollutions, of biodiversity loss. We are aware of how they are all connected. So when we demand a sustainable future, it is not only climate change. We are like expecting a more, a holistic approach to all environmental issues. And the second one would be that youth are ready for the change. When we discussed consumption behaviors and youth participation, we all agreed that we are ready, we have accepted and realized that we will have to make some choices, some different changes in our lifestyle to be a more sustainable society. And I think that is something that you should really keep in mind, that we are not the one that needs to be convinced. And if you can accomplish something, we will take it and we will make something out of it, because we are ready.
I could hear it like between the lines in what you were saying, Tina, and from what you're saying, I can hear it again. You're not so convinced about us that are not as young as you, and that goes for the parliamentarians as well. Why is it that you think that that we're not taking this seriously enough?
Are you saying we as like an older generation?
Because it seems that you feel this very strongly.
Yes, I think that, like, I think maybe that you haven't realized the consequences of what will happen when ecosystems collapse and when we are in the 2 degrees. I think that, like, been living many years with the living standards that we have now, then you're not willing to sacrifice it, and you don't believe the consequences if you don't. I'd say. What do you say? What would you say?
What would you say? Then I have to say something, and then we give the words to the parliamentarians.
Kind of, as you said, I think young people are seeing and realizing the consequences are happening now of these issues, and we're still not seeing some response that older people have also come to that conclusions, and that older people are still discussing actions that will have an effect in the long term, which is of course needed, but we want to see actions that will have an effect now as well. And we see all these calculations about how our ecosystem will change if we keep that degree or not, and it's still as if you are discussing something that is gonna happen and gonna change in like 50 years or something. But we are seeing it more as this is gonna happen now, and we want some actions, we want something that you do that show that you have also realized how urgent these challenges are.
Okay, so let me say, before I give the words to our parliamentarians in Madrid, that it is, of course, a little bit provoking to be young and also always be heard as one group that is just young. And it seems that many people think that all young people think alike. But it is, of course, equally provoking to be seen as an adult who doesn't understand anything. So now I'm going to ask you, Per. You are a member of the European Parliament, as we heard. What's your reaction to these comments from the young? I'll ask it this way this time.
Well, of course, I'm getting a lot of energy from the fact that there are so many youth out on the streets and really telling the truth in a way that, unfortunately, a lot of people, especially men in my age and older than me, still don't seem to understand. They don't understand how urgent the situation is, and also the fact that you mentioned that we need to have a holistic approach on these issues. We can't think that we can't believe that we can solve the climate crisis by, let's say, forgetting the biodiversity crisis, etc. We need to have this holistic approach, and that is something that I still lack very much in the continuing discussion about sustainability. But on the other hand, it's of course not up to the youth, to the young generation to fix this problem. It's my generation that has created it. It's also my generation that's the first generation that should at least have had enough of knowledge about the situation. I can't blame my parents, because when they grew up in the 40s and 50s in Sweden, they weren't aware of this at all. And now they're starting to change, by the way. My parents are doing a lot of good things. But me, born in the mid-60s, it's definitely my generation, which is the worst generation, if you ask me. With the first generation with enough of knowledge, with the first generation that has a lot of power and a lot of money, most of us anyhow, not all of us, but most of us. And we have a decent life, and still, most of us, once again, not all of us. And still, there's so many in my generation that just seems to not accept the fact that the whole planet is changing so fast that it is. And we have a
question. I have one more question for you, actually. Sorry to interrupt you, but we've been talking now about biodiversity specifically, and the problem that biodiversity is not discussed upon too much in these climate discussions. So will you take this with you, the biodiversity discussion, into the European Parliament?
Definitely, it's with me all the time, and I've been working with these issues now for at least 20-25 years. And some of the COP meetings have had a quite big focus, at least on forestry. And we know that if you want to have a forest that create as much carbon sequestration as possible, then it is very, very important with biodiversity. So in some cases, I think, even on this roughly abstract level of politics, biodiversity and climate are interlinked, but not as often as it should be. And I can promise you that I always have these issues in the back of my head when I'm in negotiations in different
That
issues.
sounds very promising. And now, how about you, Rasmus? You are a member of the Danish Parliament. Will you ensure now the negotiations in Madrid are almost over, but will you promise us that you bring with you the messages from these young people to the negotiations, and also take it with you into your job in the Danish Parliament from here onwards?
I would say yes, indeed, because I think the message you came with was loud and clear that you're ready for change. And that is what we need to create in order to answer both the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And I heard you in Stockholm telling us we are ready to make the change. So yes, we take that with us. Also, it's important, this toolkit that's been made is also going to be a series of workshops around in the Nordic countries where youth come together. I know in Denmark, I think it's in January. Parliaments and governments has promised to listen to what come out of it, and also to bring along youth delegates as well to the coming negotiations. So indeed, we listen to the voice of youth, because that's where we can find some of the answers, and also the courage to act, because I think the generation gap is there. I mean, we have to take it upon us as the older generations, even though I'm pretending I'm young sometimes, that it is our responsibility to act on this.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask you, were these answers satisfying?
It was nice, yes, to hear. It was I feel we heard it before.
Almost credible.
But it's yeah, it's nice. But I know there's a long way from words to action. But it was very nice. It's not to be rude or anything.
I think it was promising that you are willing to listen. But I would say that I at least will not be satisfied until I see some actions.
So we're expecting action, and the first action we will take here now is to take questions, either or both from you that are here in Stockholm and from you that are in Madrid. So I'll start here in Stockholm, because I can see you now. Who wants to ask the first question? You can ask both these people here and the people that are on stage in Madrid. And now be brave. I see total silence here. I have a question from my colleague Stina, who is brave.
Thank you, Mary. My name is Stina Fjellal. I work for the Nordic Council of Ministers. There's a lot of talk about the Article 6 from the Paris Agreement. And that seems to be a crucial issue right now. And that's why you are so depressive, I think, in Madrid. And this, a crucial point here is the carbon pricing. Why is this so difficult? That's my question.
Well, there's probably quite a lot of reasons why it is so tricky. And one of them is, of course, the one that I stated in my short introduction, the fact that there are still a lot of countries that are not willing to take the full responsibility of their action. And then they want to create these loopholes and not take full responsibility. And for some of them, I think that they are trying to just not negotiate hard enough to force the negotiators on Friday night or Saturday morning to choose between a no-deal situation or a rather bad deal situation.
So,
Yes.
how does the Nordic countries stand on this? How does the Nordic countries kind of press and how do you negotiate when it comes to carbon pricing? This is an important issue for the Nordic countries, I believe.
Yes, it is, of course. The reason that I was so late for this was that I had a meeting with our Deputy Prime Minister, Isabella Lövin, who's in charge of the Swedish delegation. And of course, it is very important for us for several reasons. And I also think that it's very good that the Nordic countries in many issues anyhow are taking some sort of leadership, because we desperately need leadership. And I, of course, would like to see much more leadership from the European Union at large as well.
I have a question here first.
Yes. Can I don't need a microphone.
You have your mic.
Yeah. So in the Convention on Biological Diversity, there is supposed to be a new framework next year. Do you have any kind of recommendations for that negotiations that we don't end up in a situation like this where the agreement probably will be postponed because the discussions aren't working out on the more technical terms? Like, how do we don't get stuck in the same way that the Paris Agreement is?
Who wants to answer this?
It's a difficult question. I want to stay optimistic and say that there are solutions to that, but in the end, like, we have to discuss technical issues as well, and that's what we're doing now. But bringing that integrated perspective and a holistic perspective to the negotiations, and keeping in mind what we're doing right now at the Paris Agreement, and having that kind of background might help us in those negotiations, so that we don't end up in the same way.
There's also one question which is maybe a little bit provoking when you come from a Nordic country where we believe that we're doing so well, both on climate and on biodiversity. And the question is, are we actually willing to pay for the damage that we do to climate and biodiversity in other parts of the world? We haven't really been behaving like we're willing to do that, to be honest. And if we continue this attitude when it comes to the damage we're doing on biodiversity in other parts of the world, then we don't exactly create a negotiation atmosphere where the other parts are going to bend toward us.
Would you like someone over there to answer that? Or was it more a rhetorical question? Nobody answers. So we have a question here in Stockholm, and then I will give the possibility to ask questions also in Madrid. But we have a question over there.
Yes, hi, my name is Fanny and I'm a youth activist. And I'm wondering, the biggest carbon sink in the world is the oceans, and I've already asked the youth delegates this, so this is to the member of parliaments. The biggest carbon sink in the world is the oceans, and it takes up 2/3 of our planet, and we know that protecting the oceans is necessary in order to keep the climate, the global warming below 1.5 degrees. How are the discussions in regards to actually protecting the oceans and the big UN Ocean Treaty that is happening and is finishing next year, 2020? How are you addressing that fact at the COP meeting?
Per, will you start here?
Well, as far as I know, during the negotiations, they're not discussing the oceans at this meeting. It's very focused on the more technical issues, and they are important, of course, so we can go full in during COP26 in Glasgow next year. But during that meeting, I suppose anyhow that we will discuss the oceans. And just as you point out, the oceans are so important to remain healthy, etc., etc. And unfortunately, we know that the warmer the oceans get, the lesser sink they will be for carbon. This is probably one of the most crucial and important so-called self-reinforcing
Feedback loops.
Feedback loops. Thank you. An easier word, feedback loops. I mean, if the oceans would get too warm in the future, if we would end up with a 4 or 5 degrees warmer world, then probably the oceans would turn from a sink to a situation where it would actually give more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So yes, indeed, it's very, very crucial that we also keep the ocean in as good shape as possible.
Rasmus, do you want to comment on
We
this
have a
as well?
question here in Madrid,
Okay.
Mary.
Yes, go
If we
on.
could take that. Yes.
Good moderating on your part. Hello? Oh,
Yes.
now we're- I'm Ludwig, the Swedish youth delegate, and I'd like to look a bit into the future. Given that we have not acted on climate change for a long time, we're now in a position where even if we manage to stay under 1.5 degrees, we will most likely have to do negative emissions of some sort. And given that things are not going the way we want them to go, we might have to go even further than 1.5 degrees and need more negative emissions. How are you working to safeguard biodiversity within those solutions? Because some of them involve up to 3 times the land area of India to do bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for instance. And these are real projects that are being proposed now and they're being planned for now. And how are you working, Per and Rasmus, to safeguard biodiversity on those issues? Thanks.
I suggest we give this question first to Rasmus because we had Per answering the previous one first.
But I think that question is very much linked to what Monika said just before about are we willing to pay the price? Because what we need to understand from a Nordic perspective is that we need to act on this and we need to pay out the money because we cannot just point fingers at others and say, you need to start building up, replanting forests to help us living the way of life we are doing now. We need to be part of that solution. I think the discussion has changed in the Nordic countries when I've met with parliamentarians from Sweden, Norway, Finland, so on, has changed in the last year into also having the global perspective. And I don't think we had it in the same way if we go back 1-2 years ago. It was very much focused on what are we doing? How can we do the transition to renewable energies? And we're good at that. But all of a sudden, that has been a change into a much more global perspective. And that's where your question come in, that we're beginning to discuss, okay, how can we actually go in and be part of the solutions that you're pointing at? So I think it's what is so funny about, and I'm also talking to Stockholm here, about these climate discussions is it has been going on for years.
25 years.
Yes. And still there are some agendas that come up like it's total new, that all of a sudden we can sit in Denmark and talk global perspectives. I mean, we should have talked that for 25 years. So for year after year, even though we can be a bit depressed on a day like this in Madrid of nothing happening in negotiations, there's also something happening in the conversations we have which are changing. And I think also what we talked about earlier about biodiversity combined with the climate crisis, and some of the answers actually come in action on the both. And that can be one of the good hooks for the coming years, is that working on biodiversity actually is a hook to also act on the climate crisis.
We have one more question here. I think we have time for that.
Hi, my name is Marcus Sansengruber. I'm working with NATO and a few different government agencies. One of my questions is, so given that the Swedish government and other government has a large ownership within the biggest polluters, so we have like SAS, we have LKAB, we have other mines, etc. How do you work with change management in order to drive the climate agenda with these large companies?
Per, will you take this?
Well, of course, we need a huge change in management. One thing that you hear more and more often now, that when you discuss climate change, what we really should discuss is system change. We need new business models. We probably need some sort of new economic system as well to solve this crisis. What I think is important is, of course, that the companies that are in the forefront and with the good examples that actually do exist, that more other companies are looking at them, and hopefully it will create some sort of momentum, because it's one of the there are many crucial central questions that we need to solve, and this is one of them, of course.
Thank you. We have one more question here.
A question that came up when we were discussing in our workshop the link between biodiversity and climate change is, on a structural systemic level, is it more effective to link the government's work on climate change and biodiversity into one, or is it best to keep it as it is now as two separate issues?
I think yes, please.
Yes.
I would think it's definitely to link them 100%, because otherwise we end up in this situation when we negotiate those two things that are so interconnected, to discuss them separately without seeing the links. I'm a lawyer, so I kind of use the law as my tool, and I wrote my master thesis out about the oceans, climate, and biodiversity. And it's really, really difficult to kind of use these different conventions today together, because they kind of overlap, but they don't, and one has priority and one doesn't. So we need to kind of treat it together, and we need to see them together.
Do you all agree on this, that this is the way to go?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Definitely. Once again, we need more of a holistic approach to these kind of system problems that we're facing. And the problem is that the longer we wait to really create a huge transformation to sort of at least try to solve the climate crisis, the more and more difficult sort of dilemmas we will run into. And we really have to avoid that. And one very good example is the one we heard a few minutes ago about if we are to create these huge negative emissions in the future, how should we do that when it comes to land use and biodiversity?
And I think also it's important to say that the two questions is also interlinked in the answers we need to come up with as politicians. And you said it's about creating new system. It's quite basically a holistic approach in changing everything, the way we behave. We have to change in order to do something. We have a question more down here, if that's okay with you, Mary?
That's okay, yes.
Yes.
Hello, my name's Virginia Young. I'm from Australia, which is on fire at the moment, as many of you will have noticed. And that actually is a result, not just of climate change, but all the past damage that we've done to our landscapes in Australia. So what we once thought of as sustainable logging has proved to make forests more fire prone. It's also been very bad for biodiversity. And the catastrophic situation we're facing now is because we have largely ignored the linkages between climate and biodiversity, and the urgent need to protect Earth's most stable ecosystems, high integrity ecosystems, and biodiversity underpins, it has a functional role in ecosystem stability and safe carbon storage. So when you're thinking about the linkages, it's really important to understand that functional role of biodiversity and ecosystem condition for the safety of carbon storage. So it's really pleasing. I have actually been operating in the climate space for a decade and created a thing in 2009 called the Ecosystems Climate Alliance, which was very hard fought at the time because people were so desperate to keep the issues separate. It's so refreshing to see that changing. And there are many areas where this convention, the climate convention, could act but hasn't. If you've read the UNFCCC, the climate convention, you'll see there's a little article called Article 4.1D, which you no doubt have noticed, which is the ecosystems provision in the climate convention that has never been operationalised. Article 5 of the Paris Agreement is actually not about just forests, it's about ecosystems, including oceans. Never operationalised. The preamble to the Paris Agreement actually calls on parties to protect biodiversity and ensure ecosystem integrity. There's a real climate reason for that. You've got to keep carbon storage in your ecosystem safe. Where the hope lies there's a fabulous piece of work that was done by an organisation called the Climate Land Ambition Rights Alliance, CLARA, on missing pathways to 1.5 degrees. And you can get there by protecting Earth's primary forests, working to support the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous people, and restoring, and this is a message for Europe and Australia and the US, 25% of your current wood production forests, provided they're natural wood production forests, and let them grow old. And you actually get a better carbon return, you get you build biodiversity, and that's better than planting new trees. So there's a lot of hope there if we pay attention.
Clear and beautiful message.
And that was a very good message, actually. We have applause here for that message. And that was a good message for us to end this briefing with. I want to remind you of two things. Number one, that please be active on social media. It's very important that we get our messages out. And the hashtag we want you to use is Nordic Climate Action. Please do it. Say what you think and let others hear it as well. That goes both to Madrid, to the world, and to you here in Stockholm. And my other reminder is that on Friday, the last day of the COP, we have at least 3 of the environment ministers from the Nordic countries at the Nordic Pavilion in Madrid. And they will gather there to answer questions from you, all of you, and to give their view on how the COP has been and what results we got. And I think we all wish that what they have to say at that point is something that makes us not depressed, but at least a little bit happy. So thank you very much to all of you over there, here, and out in the world. Thank you.